The distress signal came from the far edge of the Orion Arm, a cold, desolate sector where few dared to venture. It wasn't just the location that made it eerie. It was the silence that followed. A signal should come with follow-ups, with desperate pleas or at least a beacon's pulse. But this one? One short burst, then nothing. The Galactic Coalition had rules about responding to distress calls. Usually a survey ship would be dispatched, loaded with medical supplies and a standard diplomatic unit. They would assess the situation, determine if aid was necessary, and either render assistance or call for reinforcements. Simple. Routine. But this time, no survey teams volunteered. No diplomatic units stepped forward. Because this signal came from the Abyssal Rift, a place known for two things: mystery and death. So they called the humans. The UEG Resolute dropped out of FTL just beyond the rift, its hull thrumming as it adjusted to real space. Captain Elias Cade stood on the bridge, his fingers drumming against the steel railing. His crew, hardened veterans from the human Deathworlder fleets, were already at their stations. "Status?" Cade asked, his voice steady. Lieutenant Marquez flicked through the holo displays, scanning the void ahead. Signal originated from a shattered moon, 200 clicks from our position. No follow-up signals. No response to hails. "Any life signs?" Marquez shook her head. "Not yet. But the rift interferes with standard scans. We'll have to get closer." Cade exhaled through his nose. The rift wasn't just any ordinary void. It was a graveyard of ships, a stretch of space littered with derelicts that had met some unknown, terrible fate. Some said pirates lurked here. Others whispered about things worse than pirates. The captain tapped his communicator. "Squad 1, gear up. We're going in." 15 minutes later, a team of heavily armed soldiers descended onto the fractured remains of the moon. Their boots crunched against black dust, their visors sweeping through the abandoned wreckage. Rusted metal and shattered bulkheads told a silent story of destruction. Corporal Davis knelt by a torn-apart hull and ran a gloved hand over deep, jagged gashes. "These aren't impact marks. Something ripped through this ship." Sergeant Locke swore under his breath. "Biosigns. Faint, but something's alive in there." Cade's voice crackled over the comms. "Proceed with caution." Davis nodded and took point, leading the squad deeper into the wreckage. The air grew thick, heavy with something unseen. Their helmets compensated, filtering out toxins, but the feeling remained, an oppressive weight pressing down on them. Then the whispering began. A faint, unnatural sound slithered through their comms, just at the edge of perception. A voice, but not quite a voice. More like the idea of a voice, clawing at the edges of their minds. "Contact!" Davis shouted, raising his rifle. The shadows moved. Something was here. Something was waiting, and the Deathworlders had answered its call. Davis's shout barely had time to echo before the shadows surged forward. The squad's training kicked in instantly, rifles raised, fingers tightening on triggers. But hesitation held them back for a split second. What were they shooting at? The movement wasn't like anything they'd seen before. It was fluid, like liquid darkness slithering through the wreckage. No distinct form, no defined edges, just shifting blackness with too many eyes, gleaming faintly in the dim emergency lights. Then it struck. Corporal Davis barely had time to scream before something lashed out from the void, slamming into him with the force of a railgun. He was airborne for less than a second before his body hit the bulkhead with a sickening crunch. His rifle clattered to the ground, useless. "Open fire!" Locke bellowed. The squad erupted, their weapons spewing streaks of energy into the dark. The corridor lit up in bursts of white and red, the muzzle flashes revealing glimpses of something wrong, jagged limbs, shifting plates of organic metal, mouths that weren't in the right place. The bullets and plasma struck true, but the thing didn't scream, It shuddered, as if registering pain for the first time in its existence. Then it moved again. Fast. Too fast. Private Holt was next. A tendril shot through his chest plate as if the reinforced armor was nothing more than paper. He gasped, looking down at the writhing limb impaling him before the thing ripped him backward into the abyss. His body vanished into the dark, leaving only a smear of blood on the floor. "Fall back," Locke roared, dragging Davis by his vest as the squad retreated. Cade's voice snapped through the comms. "What the hell is happening down there? Hostile contact, unknown entity, highly adaptive, highly lethal." Locke barked, his breath ragged. "Holt's gone. Davis is down. We need immediate evac." The team backpedaled, laying down suppressing fire as they moved. But the thing didn't charge. It simply melted into the shadows again, watching, learning. Marquez's voice came over the comms, tight with tension. "Sergeant, we're picking up more movement, multiple contacts. They're all around you." Locke felt his blood run cold. "Understood. We're coming out hot." The wreckage groaned as if the moon itself were awakening. The whispers returned, louder now, crawling into their skulls like invasive parasites. "You were not meant to answer the call." It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was an infestation in their minds, something old and waiting, something that had been here long before the distress signal, and they had walked straight into its trap. Locke gritted his teeth, hauling Davis to his feet as the squad reached the exit point. The shuttle was already descending, its thrusters kicking up dust. The last two Marines laid down heavy fire, their shots carving glowing wounds into the shifting darkness. Then the ground beneath them cracked. A hand, if it could be called that, erupted from the surface, its fingers long and twisted, covered in barbed chitin. It grabbed Private Rourke by the leg and yanked. Rourke's scream was cut short as he was dragged downward into the abyss, vanishing into the moon's fractured core. The squad didn't stop. They couldn't. The shuttle door slid open, and Locke shoved Davis inside before turning to fire one last round into the encroaching dark. He could see them now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, half-formed nightmares watching with unreadable intent. The moment they stepped onto the ship, Cade's voice rang out, "Get us the hell out of here!" The shuttle's engines roared, launching them away from the ruins. The moment they breached orbit, the distress signal went silent. Gone. As if it had never existed. Locke sat heavily against the bulkhead, sweat dripping from his brow. "That wasn't a distress call," he muttered, his voice hollow. "That was a lure." Cade exhaled, rubbing his temples. "And we answered it." Outside, the abyssal rift stretched endlessly, silent once more. Waiting. The Resolute's medbay smelled of antiseptics and burnt ozone, the tang of battlefield trauma clinging to the recycled air. Davis lay on a cot, his breath shallow, his ribs shattered from the impact. The medtechs worked on stabilizing him, but everyone in the room knew the truth. Whatever hit him could have killed him outright. It had chosen not to. Cade stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. His mind raced, trying to piece together what they'd just faced. The rift had a reputation, but no reports had ever mentioned that. Creatures moving like liquid shadow, tendrils with unnatural precision, voices speaking inside their heads. And that wasn't the worst of it. Marquez appeared at his side, her face grim. "Captain, we've got a problem." Cade turned, already knowing he wouldn't like what was coming next. "Go on." She handed him a data pad. "The distress signal? It's gone. Completely erased. The ship's logs show no record of us ever receiving it. As far as the Coalition is concerned, we were never called here." Cade felt a cold chill creep down his spine. "That's impossible." She swallowed. "There's more. The shuttle's flight data. Everything we recorded in that wreck? Gone." I checked the black box. It's clean. Like we were never there. Cade's grip on the datapad tightened. Someone, or something, had wiped their records the moment they left that cursed moon. Locke, standing nearby, let out a humorless laugh. So let me get this straight. We just fought off some unholy nightmare that tore through my squad, barely escaped, and now there's no evidence we were ever there? He shook his head, his jaw tightening. Convenient? The room fell into a tense silence. Then Davis stirred. His fingers twitched, his breathing quickened. One of the medtechs reached for a sedative, but before they could inject it, his eyes snapped open. And they weren't his anymore. The whites of his eyes had gone pitch black, his pupils glowing with a faint, sickly light. His mouth opened, and from his throat came a voice that wasn't his own. A voice that didn't belong in this world. You should not have answered. The medbay's monitors flickered wildly, the lights overhead dimming as an unnatural pressure filled the air. Every screen in the room glowed with static, displaying unreadable symbols, glyphs that seemed to shift whenever one tried to focus on them. Davis's body spasmed violently, his back arching off the cot. The medtechs scrambled to restrain him, but his strength was inhuman, throwing one of them across the room. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Davis collapsed back onto the cot, unconscious once more. The air in the room felt lighter, the unnatural weight lifting. The screens returned to normal. The static was gone. Cade's heart pounded as he stepped closer. "What the hell was that?" Marquez whispered, barely breathing. "Captain, I don't think we left that thing behind." Cade's gaze shifted to the unconscious soldier, his blood running cold. They had escaped the abyssal rift. But something had come back with them. The Resolute's war room was deathly silent. The officers and specialists gathered around the central holotable, its soft glow casting eerie shadows across their faces. The screen displayed a full-body scan of Davis, his vitals surprisingly stable. But the real problem wasn't his body. It was his mind. Cade rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling in. "Tell me something useful." Dr. Elias Harlow, the ship's chief medical officer, exhaled sharply. Medically, Davis should be dead. The impact alone should have shattered his spine, but he's healing at an unnatural rate. Brain scans show activity in areas that shouldn't be active. And those symbols? He pointed at the screen, where the medbay logs still showed flickering glyphs. That's not just a visual glitch, it's rewriting parts of our database. Cade clenched his jaw. How the hell does a human brain rewrite a ship's systems? Harlow shook his head. It doesn't. But whatever hitched a ride with us? It does. Marquez leaned forward, her voice low. Captain, this isn't just some alien parasite, it's intelligent. It knew we were coming. It wiped the distress signal, erased our flight data, and now it's inside Davis, tampering with our systems. This was never an accident. Locke scoffed, arms crossed. Then what was it? Some kind of damn test? Marquez hesitated, then nodded. Maybe, or worse, maybe it was an invitation. The air grew heavier. Cade could see the unease in their eyes. They were hardened soldiers, Deathworlders who had seen horrors across the stars. And yet, this was different. This wasn't a battle against some war-hungry species or a rogue AI. This was something they didn't understand. Cade straightened. All right, we stop playing defense. If this thing wants to test us, we hit back. He turned to Harlow. We need to wake Davis up, now. The doctor hesitated. Captain, I don't think... That wasn't a request. Harlow sighed and tapped at his datapad. I'll prep a neural stabilizer, but if we wake him up and he's not alone in there... He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what he meant. The medbay was eerily quiet when Cade arrived. The usual hum of medical equipment felt off, like the machines themselves were holding their breath. Davis lay on the cot, his face peaceful. Too peaceful, like something was wearing his body instead of inhabiting it. Harlow stood beside the cot, syringe in hand. This should counteract any unnatural brain interference. If we're lucky, he wakes up as himself. Cade nodded. And if we're not? Harlow's fingers tightened around the syringe. Then we find out what it really wants. He injected the stabilizer. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Davis gasped. His body convulsed, his fingers clawing at the sheets as his breath came in sharp, ragged gulps. His eyes snapped open, black as deep space, but this time, there was something else behind them. Awareness. His lips parted, and when he spoke, it wasn't his voice. It wasn't one voice, it was many. You were not meant to come here. Cade took a step forward, his voice steady. Who are you? Davis's head twitched slightly, as if trying to recall a memory that didn't belong to him. Then he smiled. And that was worse than anything else. We are the first, the last, the forgotten. Marquez's voice crackled through Cade's earpiece. Captain, we just lost control of navigation. The ship's moving. Cade's blood ran cold. Moving where? There was a pause. Then Marquez's voice came back, shaken. Back to the rift. Cade turned back to Davis, his fists clenched. You're taking us back? Davis, or the thing inside him, chuckled. It was a hollow, empty sound. You answered the call. Now you must finish it. And just like that, the Resolute was no longer in their control. They were going back to the abyssal rift. And this time, they weren't just visitors. They were sacrifices. The Resolute moved like a ship possessed. The thrusters burned at full power, course locked, override commands ignored. The crew scrambled across the bridge, shouting, hands flying over consoles, but nothing responded. They weren't flying into the rift. They were being dragged back. Cade stood frozen for half a second, his mind racing. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a trap from the very start. He activated the ship-wide comms. All hands prepare for emergency action. We are no longer in control. Brace for whatever comes next. The crew obeyed without question. That was the thing about Deathworlders. They didn't panic. They adapted, fought back, even against nightmares. Davis, no, the thing inside him, sat up slowly, the shadows playing across his sharp features. His blackened eyes regarded Cade with something like amusement. You misunderstand. Cade leveled his sidearm at him. Enlighten me. You believe you fight against the unknown, that you resist, but you were chosen, summoned. You were always going to return. Cade stepped forward, pressing the muzzle of his gun against Davis's forehead. Then tell me why. Davis didn't blink, didn't even flinch, because only Deathworlders can open the door. The word sent a cold spike through Cade's chest. Before he could demand more, the ship lurched. The view screen filled with darkness, vast and endless. The abyssal rift. But something had changed. The rift was no longer just an expanse of dead stars and broken wrecks. It was alive. A pulsing, shifting mass loomed in the distance, a structure or a creature so massive it defied logic. A wound in the universe itself. The longer Cade stared, the more his brain refused to understand. Geometry twisted. Space folded inward. And at the center of it all, something was waiting. Marquez's voice broke through the static, tight with horror. Captain, the rift, it's responding to us. Cade forced himself to speak. Explain. She took a shaky breath. Sensors show something, a structure or an entity, and it's reacting to our presence. Davis's head tilted slightly. It wakes. Cade pressed the gun harder against his skull. Wake what? Davis finally smiled. Not cruelly, not mockingly, just knowingly. The thing that buried the first civilizations. The ship shuddered. Klaxons blared. Warning lights flared across the bridge as gravity itself twisted. Something beyond the rift was opening, and whatever was inside had just noticed them. The Resolute groaned like a wounded beast as the rift twisted around it, space warping in unnatural spirals. Cade felt the weight of something pressing against his skull, not physically, but in his mind, as though unseen fingers were sifting through his thoughts. On the bridge, chaos reigned. Consoles flickered between static and unreadable glyphs. Some of the crew clutched their heads, murmuring, eyes unfocused. Others fought against the ship's systems, desperately trying to override whatever force had seized them. Locke cursed as he slammed his fists against his terminal. Navigation's shot, engines too. We're being pulled somewhere, Captain. Marquez's hands trembled over her console. It's not just pulling us, it's reading us. Cade turned sharply. What? She swallowed, tapping through what little data remained. There's an energy signature coming from the center of the rift, where that thing is. It's scanning us, adapting, like it's trying to understand us before we arrive. Davis, still possessed, still unnervingly calm, stood at the center of the bridge, his expression unreadable. The abyss does not take blindly. It selects. It prepares. Cade's fingers tightened around his sidearm. Enough with the cryptic bullshit! What is in there? What the hell does it want? Davis turned, his darkened eyes locking onto Cade's with an intensity that felt almost sorrowful. A weapon. The ship lurched. The darkness outside moved. For a brief, horrifying second, Cade saw it. The shape buried within the rift. It wasn't just big. It wasn't just alive. It was waiting. An ancient mass of shifting, unreadable geometry. A thing that didn't fit in the universe's laws. It had no true form, only the vague suggestion of one, like something trapped between realities, unable to fully manifest in their world. But it was trying, and the Resolute was the key. Marquez's voice was barely a whisper. We weren't the first. Cade turned toward her. What? She gestured to her screen, her face pale. I don't know how, but I found something buried in the data. Fragments of an old transmission. It's thousands of years old, older than any known species. Locke leaned in. Play it. The speakers crackled. A distorted voice, barely human, barely alive, came through, twisted by time and decay. If you hear this, do not answer. Do not come. The ship shuddered again. Outside, the shifting mass in the rift began to open, and for the first time, Cade realized the horrifying truth. They hadn't found a distress signal. They'd found a warning, and they had already gone too far. The ship trembled as the abyss around them twisted and churned, pulling them deeper into the unknown. The thing inside the rift, the thing waiting for them, was waking up. Cade's knuckles were white against the grip of his sidearm, but he forced himself to stay steady. Deathworlders didn't break under pressure. They adapted. They fought. He turned to Marquez, who was still frozen, staring at the playback of the ancient transmission. How much of that message can you recover? She swallowed hard. I don't know. It's corrupted, degraded. Whatever sent it is long gone. Her fingers flew over her console, trying to extract more data, but static filled the speakers, the voice distorted beyond recognition. Not a place, it is a prison. The words sent a chill down Cade's spine. Davis, or the thing inside him, watched with eerie amusement. His eyes, once human, were nothing but endless voids, swallowing light and reflecting nothing back. You are beginning to understand. Cade leveled his gun at him. Then make me understand. What the hell is that thing in the rift? Davis smiled, and it was wrong. Not his usual cocky grin, but something detached, like an observer looking at an insect trying to grasp the universe. A remnant of the first war, a war that ended before your kind ever left your world. The ship lurched violently, the inertial dampeners struggling to compensate. Sparks flew from a nearby console. A junior officer was thrown against the bulkhead with a sickening crack. Cade gritted his teeth. What war? Davis tilted his head, as if amused by the question. The war that shaped the stars, the war that buried entire species in forgotten time. His blackened eyes seemed to flicker, like staring into an event horizon. You call yourselves Deathworlders, believing you are the most dangerous beings in the cosmos. You are children, infants who have only begun to grasp what true horrors exist. Marquez's voice came through, tight with barely contained panic. Captain, I don't know what's happening, but the rift, it's moving. It's not just a location. It's reacting to us, because we're here. The implications settled like lead in Cade's gut. It needed something to wake it up. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the bridge. Davis nodded slowly. It needed warriors, blood-bound creatures of war and survival. It needed you. Cade's stomach twisted. Why? Davis's smile widened, and this time Cade could see something shifting behind his eyes. Something ancient, something not him. Because Deathworlders do not break, they do not surrender, and that is exactly what it needs. A warning klaxon blared. Locke shouted from his station, his voice laced with something close to fear. Captain, we're crossing the event horizon. We're going in. Cade spun toward the main viewport, just in time to see the abyss split open. It wasn't a portal. It wasn't a gateway. It was a maw, a colossal, shifting void of writhing, twisting blackness, surrounded by ruins of ships, vessels from species long dead, drifting like carcasses in an ancient graveyard. And at the center of it all was something else. A structure, maybe, a creature, both. It pulsed with unnatural energy, its form impossible to describe, shifting between solid and intangible, as if it existed in more than one reality at once. Cade's breath caught. He had seen monsters before. He had seen war, genocide, the horrors of space. But this? This was something else. Something that had been locked away for a reason. The ship buckled again as it was pulled closer, the gravitational forces of the rift dragging them into its core. Cade made a decision. Locke, prep emergency thrusters. Marquez, divert all power to the engines. Burn everything if you have to. Locke's fingers flew over his console. Not responding. It's overriding every damn system we have. Davis exhaled softly. You cannot fight what you do not understand. Cade turned on him. Then help us understand, damn you. If this thing wanted us dead, it could have ripped us apart already. What does it want? Davis regarded him, expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. It does not want to kill you. His blackened eyes flickered, and for the first time since his possession, something human flashed across his face. Fear. It wants to make you part of it. A chilling silence fell over the bridge. Cade's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. This wasn't just a trap. It wasn't just an ancient horror waiting to be freed. It was recruiting. The rift wasn't a place. It was a living war machine, waiting for something strong enough to wield it, waiting for something ruthless, waiting for Deathworlders. The ship trembled violently as the rift consumed them, swallowing the resolute whole. And then, everything went dark. Darkness swallowed the resolute, a void deeper than space itself, crushing, suffocating. Every screen went black. Every system failed in an instant. the hum of the engines, the distant whir of the ventilation system. Gone. For the first time in his life, Cade felt truly blind. Then came the voices. Whispers slithering through the void, curling around his mind like unseen tendrils. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel their meaning. Hunger, expectation, an ancient quiet laughter. And then, the ship's lights flickered back to life. They weren't in normal space anymore. The bridge was eerily silent, the crew frozen in place. Marquez clutched her console, her breathing ragged. Locke wiped cold sweat from his forehead. No one spoke. No one moved. Outside the viewport, the rift had changed. The swirling mass of darkness was no longer a vast, distant wound in space. Now it surrounded them, pressing in like a living thing. And beyond it, Cade's breath hitched. They were inside something. Titanic walls of obsidian metal stretched out in every direction, forming impossible structures that defied logic. They pulsed with a sickly, shifting light, neither machine nor flesh. It was an architecture that no known species could have built, because no sane mind could have imagined it. And at the center of it all was the core. A monolith that pulsed like a heartbeat, black veins of shifting energy threading through the massive structure. It was incomprehensibly large, stretching beyond their ability to measure. And it was alive. A tremor ran through the ship. "Captain," Marquez's voice was barely above a whisper, "I think it's talking to us." Cade turned to her. "How?" She gestured to her screen, where indecipherable symbols flashed in rapid succession. "I don't know. I don't even know if this is a language, but I feel it, like it's pressing into my thoughts." Davis let out a breath, a deep, hollow sound. "It speaks in the ways your kind cannot yet understand." Cade turned sharply. "And you can?" Davis didn't answer immediately. His face was pale, his posture unnervingly still. The thing inside him was watching, calculating. Then, without warning, the ship moved. Not by thrusters, not by any force they could measure. It was dragged forward, deeper into the core's labyrinth. "Locke," Cade barked. "Can you override it?" Locke was already working furiously, but his expression told Cade everything. "Nothing, sir. I might as well be pressing buttons on a brick." The monolith loomed ever closer. And then, a sudden jolt. Every screen flickered, showing something new. Not data, not static. A vision. The bridge vanished. For a brief moment, Cade wasn't standing on the Resolute anymore. He was somewhere else. A battlefield. An impossible war, stretching across a sky that wasn't a sky at all, twisting, burning, filled with the wreckage of civilizations he didn't recognize. Cities turned to ash. Planets split open like wounds. Stars collapsed into screaming voids. And in the heart of it, the core, or something like it, he saw them. The first ones. Not like Davis, not possessed. Something worse. They weren't piloting the rift's power. They had become it. Weapons made from flesh and thought. War forms sculpted from the essence of dead worlds. Soldiers reforged into monsters. The rift had not just been a battlefield. It had been a forge. A war machine designed to take the strongest, the most ruthless, and reshape them into something beyond mortality. And it had failed. The last remnants of that ancient war had locked it away, sealing it beyond the edge of the galaxy. The ones who had sent the warning had fought to keep it buried. But now, the Resolute had answered the call. Cade gasped, stumbling back as the vision ripped away, reality slamming back into place. His head pounded. His skin was ice cold. He wasn't the only one. The entire bridge crew was shaking, sweat beading on their faces. Locke was the first to break the silence. What? What the fuck was that? Davis exhaled slowly. Memory. Cade's pulse thundered in his ears. That's what this is. That's why we were called here. Marquez's voice was hoarse. It wants to make us like them. Davis nodded once. And now you understand why you were chosen. The ship trembled again. On the view screen, the monolith's pulsing veins of energy brightened, flowing toward the ship like tendrils, reaching, seeking, testing. Cade gritted his teeth. He knew what came next. A choice. A test of will. He could feel it, the weight of the rift pressing into his thoughts, searching for something. He knew without a doubt that if he let it in, if he accepted what it offered, he would become something else, something more, something less human, and he had no idea if he would ever come back. Davis watched him carefully. This is where you decide. The rift pulsed again, and it waited. The Resolute hung in the abyss, cradled in the grip of something that should never have existed. The rift pulsed, patient, expectant. It wasn't just holding them. It was offering something. A trade. Cade could feel it, pressing against the edges of his mind. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was instinct, knowledge bleeding into his thoughts like ink in water. The rift wasn't a mindless force. It was sentient, and it was waiting for him to answer. The crew's breathing was ragged, too many of them still reeling from the vision. Locke looked sick. Marquez's hands were shaking against her console. But Davis stood at ease, watching Cade with those abyssal eyes, not quite smiling, not quite human. You know what it wants. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something eager. Cade tightened his jaw. Yeah, he said. I do. The rift wasn't a prison anymore. Not exactly. It was a forge, a crucible that had been waiting for the right material. And now it had Deathworlders. Cade could feel it testing him, brushing against his thoughts like unseen fingers, feeling for the edges of his will. It wasn't speaking to him so much as examining him. Was he worthy? Could he survive the transformation? The thought made his blood run cold, because deep down he knew, if he said yes, if he let the rift take him, he wouldn't be the first. He would be the next. He forced himself to tear his gaze away from the pulsing monolith, looking instead at his crew, the people who had followed him to the edge of the known universe, who had trusted him to bring them home. Marquez swallowed hard. Captain, we can't let it in. Locke's voice was hoarse. If we say yes, we're dead. No, we're worse than dead. Cade didn't disagree, but he could feel the weight of it, the truth. If they rejected the rift, it wouldn't just let them go. It had waited too long. It had chosen them. Davis cocked his head, blackened eyes gleaming. You still believe you have a choice. Cade raised his gun. You still believe you're in control. Davis exhaled a quiet laugh. You misunderstand. The rift does not force. It offers. It gifts. It evolves. Cade's grip tightened. And what the hell did it do to you? Davis's expression didn't change. It showed me the truth. His voice was almost reverent. Cade had seen men break under war. He had seen soldiers lose themselves to fear, to the horrors of battle. Davis hadn't broken. He had surrendered. The rift pulsed again, and suddenly Cade wasn't on the bridge anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark, somewhere inside it. He stood in an endless void, weightless, surrounded by shifting shadows. Shapes moved in the dark, too fast to see, too slow to be real. And then something spoke, not in words, not in sound, but in understanding. A voice inside his skull, in the deepest part of him, whispering in a language older than time. You are strong. A cold shudder ran down his spine. But you are not complete. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around him, threading into his veins, his bones, his thoughts. And suddenly, he understood. The rift hadn't been a battlefield. It hadn't even been a weapon. It had been a proving ground. A place where warriors had been forged, where the strongest were reshaped into something more. But not just anyone. Only those who survived. Cade gritted his teeth, every instinct screaming at him to fight back, to resist. But the rift wasn't an enemy in the way he knew. It wasn't attacking him. It was offering him a choice. A chance to become something beyond human, beyond Deathworlder. And for a moment, just a moment, he was tempted. Because what if they weren't enough? What if they couldn't win? What if this was the only way? His pulse thundered in his ears. And then he thought of his crew, of Marquez, terrified but unbroken, of Locke, gripping his console like a lifeline, of the men and women who had trusted him to get them home. They weren't meant to die in this place. They weren't meant to become this place. Cade's eyes snapped open, and he rejected the rift. The shadows recoiled violently, the whispering voices twisting into an agonized screech. And then, he was back. The bridge snapped into focus, the monolith still pulsing beyond the viewport. His body ached, his mind throbbed, but he was himself. And the rift knew it had failed. The walls of the abyss trembled. The ship shuddered violently, alarms blaring, every screen flickering with unreadable warnings. Locke swore. "Captain, I know," Cade barked. The rift wasn't letting them go. If it couldn't convert them, it would consume them. Cade spun toward Marquez. "Find me a way out. Now." She didn't hesitate, hands flying over her console. "There's a gap in the gravitational field. We can break free if we overload the core." "That'll fry our engines," Locke snapped. "It's that or die here," Cade shot back. Locke hesitated, then cursed. "Fine. Doing it." The rift howled. The monolith's veins of energy surged forward, reaching for them. And the Resolute fired every ounce of power it had. The ship screamed through the rift, engines burning, tearing free from the crushing grip of an ancient, hungry force. The monolith twisted, shifted, and then the Resolute broke through. The rift vanished behind them. The darkness collapsed inward, and suddenly they were back. Normal space. The Resolute drifted, engines dead, power flickering. But they were alive. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Locke let out a ragged laugh. "Holy fuck," Marquez slumped against her console. Did we win?" Cade exhaled slowly, and then he turned to Davis. The possessed man still stood there, watching. But his blackened eyes, they weren't watching with anger or defeat. They were watching with patience, like he already knew something they didn't. And then, softly, he smiled. "You never escaped." A cold chill ran down Cade's spine. The rift was gone. But something had come with them. And it was waiting. Waiting for the right moment, waiting for the next choice, and deep down, Cade knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot.